These are your fast facts on the book of Galatians. First, Galatians was probably one of Paul's first epistles. Although Galatians is listed fourth in the Pauline books in our New Testament canon, which roughly lists the Pauline epistles by length, Romans is the longest, followed by 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and so on, it was probably written well before the other epistles, probably before AD 48 and the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15. But this dating scheme is heavily dependent on exactly what Paul meant when he referred to the churches in Galatia. Second, Galatia could be understood ethnically or politically. Ethnic Galatians lived in the north, in an area that Paul may have covered in his second and third missionary journeys, if you look at Acts 16:6, 18:23. The political province of Galatia is in the south, an area that Paul covered in his first missionary journey during his well-documented visits to Pisidian Antioch, Lystra, Iconium, Derbe, and those happening in Acts 13 through 14. So if we see the reference in Galatians as ethnic, we would see the book as written later in Paul's ministry, after his second or third missionary journey. But given the compelling nature of evidence for Paul's ministry in South Galatia, and the fact that Galatians 2 includes multiple references to Barnabas, Paul's companion on the first journey, the political province of Galatia and the early date seem most reasonable. Third, Galatians demonstrates that categories for heresy and orthodoxy existed early in the church. According to the teaching of 19th and 20th century theologian Walter Bauer and the successive teaching of many in the liberal Protestant vein, including modern skeptical scholar Bart Ehrman, the early church maintained a wide array of beliefs about Jesus. According to these scholars, the competing narratives eventually lost out to the one that gained influence through the hierarchy of the Roman Church, starting in the 4th through 6th centuries. In other words, Bauer taught that heresy preceded orthodoxy. Instead, the book of Galatians, a book that is uncontested as authentically from Paul, we see here a clear view of how strongly early Christians defended the boundaries of their beliefs. Instead of a fluid and diverse patchwork of teachings, Paul articulates a single apostolic and orthodox doctrine of salvation, from which no truly Christian group or individual could dissent. Fourth, the opponents in Galatia were Judaizers. Judaizers were those who would compel Christians to combine their Christian faith and message with Jewish practices. Specifically, in Galatians 6:12, there was clearly an effort to compel Galatian Gentile believers in Jesus to be circumcised. Fifth, Paul is supportive of the Mosaic Law. Paul's response to those who are insisting on circumcision was not to disparage the law of Moses. Instead, in Galatians 3:21, Paul says that the law is not opposed to the promises of God. He goes on to speak of the law as a, quote, guardian in verse 24. This echoes Paul's positive teaching about the law as holy, righteous, and good in Romans 7:12. What Paul does contest in Galatians is the misuse of the law in an effort to gain a righteous standing before God. As he says in chapter 5, verse 4, "You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace." Sixth, the role of the law and justification in Galatians is hotly contested. The historic Protestant view, as articulated by the Reformers, emphasized that Paul was rejecting the law as a means of becoming right with God and saw parallels to the practices of the Roman Catholic Church in their use of the sacraments to little by little make someone righteous. The recent New Perspective view takes a gentler view toward Jewish teaching of the era, noting that in many of the surviving Jewish texts, the law was not specifically seen as a legalistic tool to make one righteous before God. Instead, the New Perspective writers would suggest that Paul is only pushing back against the use of Jewish boundary markers, such as circumcision. Although there may be some truth to the fact that the Reformers heavily understood the legalism that Paul addresses in Galatians through the lens of the Roman Church of their day, so there probably is also some naivete in the idea that Jewish teachings of the day were entirely free of any sort of legalism or works righteousness, something that no one in the Christian church is free from today. Seventh, Galatians sketches a map of salvation history. Paul's use of Abraham, particularly in chapter 3, demonstrates the importance of faith throughout all of history in the salvation of God's people. Instead of seeing Moses as an interruption for our need of faith, Paul shows Moses and the law as clarifying and underscoring our need of faith and the promise of God's righteousness that would one day come through Christ. In this way, Paul shows how God's work of salvation, and indeed the whole of the Bible, is connected to Christ. Eighth, to circumcise or not to circumcise. In Galatians 2:3, Paul indicates that he refused to circumcise Titus. This practice seems like a double standard because we learn that likely later in Paul's ministry he would circumcise Timothy, if you look at Acts 16:1-3. The difference between these two men was that Timothy was half Jewish and Titus was fully Gentile. Timothy's circumcision was in line with his ethnic heritage and maintained open doors to the Jewish community, while Titus's non-circumcision pushed back on the pressure to force Gentiles to follow the Jewish law. Ninth, 400 years or 430 years? In Galatians 3:17, Paul indicates that the time lapse from Abraham to the law is 430 years. Yet in Stephen's teaching in Acts 7:6, as well as back in Genesis 15:13, the number 400 is used. Some have suggested that Paul's 430 years here in Galatians is a more specific number, while 400 is a rounded number. Others have suggested that 400 years is referring to a slightly different span of time, starting at a different point. 10th, fallen away from grace? What does Paul mean in Galatians 5:4 that people have fallen away from grace? Is he contradicting other parts of the Bible that state that no one can lose their salvation? There are two possible answers. One, Paul could be saying that they have fallen away from truly understanding what grace means. Or, secondly, Paul could be making a hypothetical claim here that he counters in verse 10, saying that he's confident that this is not truly the case with the Galatian believers. And those are your fast facts on the book of Galatians.